Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 1. Progeny of Hate. Chapter 2. A Somber Warning. The blade was a scythe of light, severing limbs as neatly as turning the swords of tempered steel. It danced to its own wild rhythm, lunging, parrying, driving and slicing in an ecstasy of fleetness. Its partner followed in fevered pirouettes and acrobatic leaps, sometimes just a blur of impossible motion, his neatly bearded face set in a grin of impish enjoyment. Sweat glistened on his bare torso and seemed oddly out of place, as if such elated exercise could not cause it expounder any physical effort. In stark contrast with his heavily armored opponents, he was dressed in a loose-fitting pair of white trousers, or tracks, after the track islanders who wore them, shoved into light leather ankle boots. His sun-browned, muscled frame seemed to carry an enchantment of its own, negating the use of protective trappings, since, despite the heavily stacked odds, he remained untouched by enemy weapons. Roars of approval rose from the fevered crowd as the huing spectacle ebbed and flowed. The atmosphere was approaching that of a harvest festival, the onlookers viewing the craft of a talented artisan at work, rather than the mere slaughter of men. It was, of course, a different spectacle when experienced from outside the arena. And indeed, these were not men falling before the master's blade, but rabble from faraway regions, bred and trained for the ring alone. This was a singular opportunity to swell one's purse as well as be entertained, and coins were changing hands with loud regularity. Even the rich and illustrious condescended to dabbling in a spot of friendly betting, shrugging over losses of coin commoners would spend a lifetime gathering. These lords placed their bets through scurrying servants or mere nods of the head, keeping their distance from the handlers, peering down from walled and pillared platforms, emblazoned in rich colors with coats of arms, tapestries, and shading. The royal days, however, held only 2 spectators. A man of roughly 40 cycles, sporting a pointed beard and decked in golden ornament, and a much younger woman, dark-haired, with a certain childlike honesty in her visage and posture. Her face was slightly flushed with more than just the morning heat. The man spoke with a certainty and calculated disdain that marks those of high rank.
It is the mark of civilized men that they can, on occasion, appreciate skill and strength of arms in the arena.
He looked at his companion askance, and she suppressed a shudder before replying.
You forget that I am but a woman, Turek. I am more concerned with issues of life than the spectacle of death.
Yes.
Thierry could not prevent the curling of his lip.
I forget. My gentle cousin Haldred will bear children to keep the wolves from our doors. She forgets that these children will only be meat for wolves if they cannot wield hard steel with strong arms.
A fine way it is to instruct them in the use of such, by pitting them against that Viron demon. You are feeding lambs to a lion.
They are hardly lambs, dear cousin. No, these are seasoned men. Each one is a dangerous adversary to this Viron demon, as you refer to Lord Rune. Yes, he holds the advantage, since he possesses skills and qualities they can never hope to attain.
Then why sacrifice them to this fiend? Look, by all that's holy, he is smiling. He is enjoying the slaughter.
My dear ignorant Haldred, they are not soldiers training for battle. These are poor wretches from the fighting pits in 6 lands. This is good business, apart from first-class entertainment. Do you realize how much gold will change hands at the end of such a little bout?
Then how does this barbaric spectacle serve to instruct our young men in battle? You made that up only to justify it.
Far from it. There are many young men watching the proceedings with keen interest. They are not merely enjoying the show, but are learning the finer points of swordplay, to be discussed at the later stage and practiced endlessly. They will not forget what they have seen in this arena.
Why not merely ask this wondrous Lord Rune to instruct the young fighters instead of having them witness such a spectacle?
You are antagonistic today. Do I detect a note of admiration for this foreigner? I'm not sure if Julos would approve.
Haldred looked scandalized. The suggestion was preposterous.
What? Are you insinuating? Oh no, you are not baiting me today, Turik. And Julos would care much less than you would think.
Her last remark went unheeded for the most part. For that moment there was a gasp of dismay from the spectators. Turik craned forward to improve his view. A single opponent remained of the 24 that had entered the arena with Rune. He was a large man, but moved with grace and ease. Throughout the engagement he had remained outside the reach of the dancing executioner biding his time. Rune's chest heaved slightly from his previous efforts, but he seemed fresh enough. He halted several paces away from the larger man. Lowering his sword, he bowed mockingly and flashed him a smile. The other man retaliated immediately. His attack was a well-practiced maneuver, relying on speed and a preconception of the opponent's reaction. It was apparent to Rune that someone had prepared this fighter to deal with his evasiveness. Every blocking move or elusive step found a swift new threat on its heels. Each fresh attack seemed to force a certain response, which in turn provoked a new attack. It was an extremely complex tactic, evidently taught by a master, and practiced to perfection. Rune knew the end of it would penetrate his defense at some point, knew he had to break the chain somewhere before that moment came. He was in steady retreat towards the wall supporting the royal dais, locked in a grisly dance. Momentarily, he even allowed the man to feel he was in command of the process. When the crowd had gasped enough for his liking, he used what he knew the other had no counter for. He moved swifter than the eye could see, quicker than the striking asp, inserting an additional move between the furious attacks of his adversary. The blow was so swift his assailant never realized it had fallen, never felt its effect, but instead of severing a limb or wounding, the cut merely separated a fastening of the other man's hardened leather armor. So did the next, and the next, gradually undoing every binding with immaculate precision. Rune was enjoying himself again. He knew the man was at his mercy, and he felt the fierce exhilaration of withholding that mercy, a game of cat and mouse, the outcome never in doubt. It brought a sweet pain, an ache that somehow satisfied a longing of which he was only faintly aware. He bathed his mind in it, inviting the numbness. Suddenly he had had enough. With a shout he blocked an attack before it was properly underway and whirled away from the attacker towards the center of the arena. The man turned to follow in bewilderment just to have his armor separate at the seams and fall away in pieces. The look of astonishment was still on his face when the blade ran through his innards and only slightly tempered when his head left his shoulders. The roars were deafening. Rune strutted round with raised arms, the gory blade extended from his right hand. He had the arrogance to incline his head to the crowd and the royal dais before making an exit. This disappearance created mixed feelings among the spectators, some of whom had once more lost substantial sums, in the vain hope that this time the wizard would meet his match. Others grumbled at the briefness of the spectacle, a prolonged desperate struggle being more gratifying to their particular tastes. Most, however, were in awe of the impossible skill, the arrogant disdain with which this champion treated the toughest opponent. They would make familiar remarks, claiming some special affinity with the object of their admiration. "It's not a common fighter like the others, you know. Oh no, seems he does it for the sport almost. Is a lord of some note over in the islands. Born up in the coldest north he was, only making a name in the islands after some commotion up in Noria." They would lean in secretively, rolling their eyes. "Something to do with his brother, the king. And the queen involved somewhere too, no doubt. Mind you, it's been 10-12 cycles ago, but the tales are still running." Here they would wink confidentially, as if they hadn't told the story scores of times before. The counters and dealers were in high spirits, though, their purses jingling, while their cracked voices took up the call of odds for the next encounter. Among them 2 men speaking in undertones seemed not to share the general excitement. Indeed, they were irate, if anything, glumly discussing the preceding spectacle under their breath. Both were well dressed and displayed their apparent wealth in a lavish and showy manner. Gold rings and bracelets, bejeweled hilts and girdles, and sparkling amulets flashed in the sun as they gestured and moved about. They were both rather lank with dark complexions, and their loose-fitting garments and animated speech set them apart as islanders like Lord Ruin. One sported a neat chin beard and mustache. The other, clean-shaven, had his long hair tied tightly behind his head in the fashion of Arius, the mainland city they were visiting. He seemed to be leading the conversation.
So much for Hadrax. I must confess, I had expected a little more after all the assurances we received, not to mention the amount of money that changed hands.
The bearded man replied with the wisdom of hindsight.
No, Zebar. I had my reservations about our latest hope from the outset. He should not have waited till the end before closing in. No single man can face the Nurian. He was too confident. What had Oglan taught him?
I have lost my confidence in Oglan. It is time we turn to the Easterners. This is no longer only about money, although this Nurian has cost me an island already. It is a matter of honor now. We have to play to his weaknesses, not take him on where he is invincible.
What do you have in mind?
He is overly fond of a pretty face. He drinks heavily on occasion. He has a cruel streak that even I have to envy him. These can all be used to our advantage.
We will need another champion. I have...
No, this time, Gron, I will bring him down by his own arrogance, and will not be in the arena.
Esteemed comrade, I need not remind you that such schemes have never succeeded in the past. I believe he is assailable. The arena is the place where his overconfidence will be his destruction, and it could be a very profitable venture at the same time.
Profitable? I would need to venture half a kingdom to recoup my losses. You may find a new buffoon to sacrifice for the pleasure of the crowd. As for me, I'll bide my time.
Both men fell silent, while some unfortunate condemned wretches were shunted into the arena. They looked on dispassionately as the leg irons were removed and the guards hastily retreated. Zebar creased the brow of his not unhandsome face in contemplation.
I believe he will return to Keratin 2 days from now. We may arrange to meet up with him somewhere. Perhaps help him onto a reef.
Gron laughed heartily.
We'll see if this cat can swim, eh?
It was an evening on which to fall in love. The cool sea air banished any thought of the daytime heat, and garnished itself with the fragrance of musk rose and honeysuckle. The colonnades were bedecked with these and many other blooms in lavish nets of intoxicating aroma. Even the lamps were glowing softly with perfumed oil. It was early still, the western sky infused with the golden passing of Imran's luminescence, while Lauren's eyes hovered in the east in their eternal frown. Haldred made her way to the garden hall, when she was sure the guests would already be occupied with their refreshments and merriment. She despised the measuring stairs that accompanied the noted entrance. The women would be envious at best, spiteful and snide in their remarks. The men would reduce her to the level of a strumpet with a single glance and a brash comment to a companion. Perhaps she had been too secluded in Amherst, and had lost her appreciation for the sophisticated false laughter, the coquetry and the intrigue of the court where she had grown up. Perhaps it was Julas, her husband, who had fueled her disdain by no longer making any attempt to hide his many amorous adventures. The court that had enslaved her with its mysteries and clever conversations as a child had lost its appeal entirely, now that its cruelty had become apparent. Here romance was reduced to a night's passion with a stranger, a slight dalliance of the flesh. It required a certain ruthlessness she had lost when she had fallen in love with Julas. That had made her vulnerable, a victim of idealism, and had left her hurting and isolated. Nowhere did that isolation become more unbearable than in the presence of these courtiers who had robbed her. The hall was immense, and could have held 3 times the 500 or so guests that were present. It allowed her to slip in relatively unnoticed and make her way quietly to the center. The tables lined the eastern wall, groaning under their burden of refreshments that included exotic fruits and a large variety of carved meat. Servants hurried this way and that to refill goblets with the wine requested. Conversation and laughter ebbed and flowed round the smaller tables where the guests arranged themselves in cliques and gossiping groups. At least 3 minstrels vied with one another and the boisterous company at intervals along the eastern wall. To Haldred, the center of the hall seemed comparatively calm. She dispatched a servant to fetch what she had an appetite for and seated herself at an empty table from where she could scrutinize the festivities. A figure detached itself from a table shared with 3 ladies and sauntered over to her. The ladies stared in her direction in a manner they hoped would convey their displeasure at the interruption. Turic had changed his clothes for the occasion and made use of the opportunity to show off his wealth. Haldred thought he made himself ridiculous with the amount of gold and jewelry transported on his person, but he had made the effort to come over and she would not point out the obvious. He seated himself next to her.
Fine evening, cousin.
Haldred was all too aware of the grudging looks to indulge him.
For you, perhaps, Turic. You are the untethered bull amongst the cows.
She couldn't resist placing a little emphasis on the last word. Turic was somewhat taken aback.
How crude. I would have allowed for a far greater appreciation of my flair than such a comparison would suggest.
Of course. Please excuse my lack of tact. I may still be affected by the gruesome spectacle today.
Turic clicked his tongue.
Cousin, you've become intolerably old-fashioned in your country stronghold. I'll grant you have not attended the festival in the last 6 cycles.
8.
But the spectacles have been demonstrative for far longer than that. The Ligerian of today is no longer satisfied with a few jugglers and tumblers.
I'd not been brave or foolish enough to attend the spectacle before. You forget I'd barely 18 cycles when I left for Amorous.
And there you existed as a recluse.
Far from it, Turic. I soon had a child to care for. Besides, the Duke keeps a lively court of his own design. Estium is a rich land.
Ah, but the talk is that you hardly ever immersed yourself in this lively society.
Turic smiled indulgently.
Believe not everything you hear, cousin.
I have reliable sources.
All tales gain in weight with the telling.
They wouldn't be tales if someone had not inspired them.
Or some others never believed them.
She couldn't prevent a smile. Turic laughed loudly.
Ah, you are defensive, Haldred, admit it.
There would be no need if you were not offensive.
And neatly she turns the conversation in my direction. You should have been a diplomat, cousin. It is a crime to keep your entertaining banter locked up in Amorous.
Your tactics are ineffective this time. I am in no mood to be taken back to discussing Amorous, with or without flattery.
He pretended to look sour.
I can see you are too clever for me tonight. Perhaps they should ban the fighting and place the 2 of us in the arena.
I'm sure the commoners would not applaud. What would they lose their earnings on?
The servant arrived with her requested fare and arranged it on the table for her. Turic finished his wine with a quick gulp. Haldred silently appreciated his company. It dispelled the awkwardness of her self-imposed solitude. She felt guilty that he was doing her a kindness at the cost of alienating his companions.
You should not keep your voluptuous companions waiting too long. They may spread their nets in other directions. Else I would invite you to join me, at the peril of having my eyes scratched out. You can see the servants here believe me to be underfed. This is enough for 4.
She motioned to the laden table. Turic laughed again.
I accept. Let the 3 scarecrows spread all the nets they like. You can count on it that they will be faithfully awaiting my pleasure when I decide to pay them some attention again. Everyone knows they are reserved.
Their conversation did not lag during supper. Turic was fond of his cousin and disliked the fact that she had somehow changed into a social outsider. He was intrigued by it and curious to discover the whole truth behind it. He kept up a barrage of probing questions which were parried or ignored. They had barely finished the meal when another man detached himself from a group of heavily drinking men and ambled in their direction.
I'll have to take my leave, esteemed cousin. See who approaches.
Tyric's voice had dropped to a conspiratorial murmur.
Fengis? Why would you avoid him? Something to hide, Tyric?
The man is mad, Heldred, and I've heard enough of his ramblings to last a dozen lifetimes. It's embarrassing at best and irritating at worst to have a conversation with such an oddity. For the life of me, I cannot understand why they let him in the door.
Tyric slipped away swiftly, having lingered long enough to make the reason for his action all too obvious. The man approaching her was at least as fashionably attired as the other guests. Arrayed in a rich brocaded doublet and pointed shoes, he could be taken for a dandy if it were not for his weathered face and close-cropped dark hair. What truly set him apart was his expression and manner. He seemed simply too serious and purposeful, in contrast with the gay abandon and frivolity displayed by the elegant assembly.
At last I've tracked you down, Heldred. Someone at least with enough intelligence to converse with, and save me from this bedlam.
He was smiling as if at some pleasantry, but his eyes insisted that he meant every word.
Fengis, good evening to you too. You rate me rather highly for such an insignificant member of this illustrious kingdom. If it were someone else addressing me, I would be forced to detect a note of flattery.
She was a little confused as to his seeking her out at all.
Kingdom soon to be empire. We are on the brink of war, Heldred. Does that not disturb you?
His gaze was slightly discomforting.
It does, of course.
You do not see it as some great adventure? Some opportunity for attaining glory and riches?
I do not concern myself with politics, Fengis.
Perhaps you should.
Are you going to engage me in a political argument?
He forced a laugh.
There are forces at work in our dear kingdom that are more than just sinister. They are frightening. It behooves every one of us to gain as much insight as we can. Disaster overtakes those who are not prepared.
And you will give me this insight? You will prepare me for the disasters to come?
Her tone was a little scornful. He shrugged.
I feel it my duty to tell you at least a little of what I know or suspect.
Why me?
You're the only person who does not avoid me out of habit.
If you are looking for sympathy...
Sympathy? You're the one in need of sympathy, so blissfully ignorant. No one wants to hear ill tidings, but does that make them disappear? We are incapable of meeting any threat, for we refuse to acknowledge.
Heldred sighed impatiently.
Spare me a lecture on the decay of the kingdom and the dreadful state of border defenses nobody needs anymore. You are born out of time, Fengis.
He was more than a little stunned. Momentarily at a loss, he glanced at the festive clusters of drinking, laughing guests, reclining on cushioned benches or lounging on the outskirts. He would never feel a part of their world.
If you had an inkling of what will come upon us, Heldred, you wouldn't sit here as a skeptic. You'd make preparations to save yourself.
He had lowered his voice.
You forget that I have a husband and child.
He is your husband only in name, Heldred. You must be aware.
Do not speak to me of Julas.
You spoke of him.
You have no understanding of my position.
Forgive me. It was not my intention to upset you. Please disregard what I said.
I'm not upset. It is dangerous to make assumptions about my marriage when you do not have all the facts at your disposal. People form their opinions based on rumor and perception. I'm tired of hearing whispers and insinuations from strangers.
Am I a stranger, then?
No, but I know you are not aware of what has happened between Julas and me. He spends his time at court, and I sometimes need to breathe fresher air than what surrounds me here, that's all. Even the walls of Ambrose close in on me on occasion, and I need to see the fields and the forest.
Are you restless?
No, I am satisfied. It's just the sameness of it all, the pretense. I'm not well suited for this style of life. I fear my wit is not as sharp as is necessary for reputation in this society.
Tell me, Heldred, why did you leave your son in Amherst? You plan a speedy return there?
I prefer to postpone his introduction into society for as long as I can. Arid is delicate, Fengis, not frail, but he cares too much for little things and is easily upset. I fear he will not hold his own against the ruthless boys and unscrupulous girls of court. I cannot bring myself to teach him guile. It will ruin him, and I'm not the best teacher in that regard.
To your credit, Heldred. How old is the boy now? 7?
8. He is eager and intelligent, but I will protect him as long as I can. I cannot bear the thought of seeing him here one day, scheming and plotting with the rest, falling for some power-hungry hussy.
There was a burst of hilarity from across the room. The shrill laughter of several women and loud guffaws of mirth from inebriated men surrounded a blond-haired man in his middle cycles. He was demonstrating some lewd action with red-faced energy, his mouth set in an idiotic smile.
There he is, my dear Julos, in his element. I envy him sometimes. He never has a shortage of admirers, albeit for the wrong reasons.
Wrong reasons? You do not approve of our entertainment?
Thing is, it's immoral, and somehow beneath a man like him, he debases himself like a jester.
You stand in the middle of a perfume brothel and speak to me of morals. Are you faithful then?
Haldred blushed.
If I am, I have to admit that it is somewhat enforced. I tell you this, brother, in confidence, but I certainly have been tempted to take a lover, discreetly of course, far from the gossip's prying eyes. I am 27, Julos is escapading, half the cycle I am alone in Amorous.
What prevents you?
The men of Estium fear their duke's younger brother, even though Perian and Julos spend most of their time in the capital. They treat me with the utmost courtesy. I would have to make myself real cheap, and then may still be refused. I do not believe I will survive the embarrassment.
I say again, Haldred, you are a jewel. This decadent kingdom is not worthy of.
Despite my confessed lasciviousness,
Vengi shrugged. He seemed distracted once more, hardly taking in what was being discussed. The heavy frown returned to his brow.
I am leaving for the line, sister, and I cannot say whether I will return. I owe you the knowledge I have carried around with me these past cycles. We are moving to subdue Lysan to the south. That is not my main concern, although I believe it to be a mistake. It is still a secret, and I urge you not to mention it to anyone, not even Arid. I have a fear in me that compels me to be rash. I run the risk of being ridiculed, I know.
you run the risk. Vengis, if it were not for your parentage, and maybe your commission and ability in the host, there would not be a man in Ligurium who wouldn't laugh at you openly. Do you know what they think of you? You are a madman to most. You supported the failed Reformation. You disappear for seasons at a time. You are not married, nor do you show the least interest in women. Some even say you are guilty of unnatural love. Then you ramble to everyone within hearing of prophecies and legends. It is too late to run the risk, brother. You are being ridiculed.
And you?
I care for you, Vengus, and it hurts me to see the disdain with which the powerful men cast you aside. Why are you bent on this course?
Scorn me if you like. I will not be guilty of your blood.
My blood? Who would plot against me?
Not against you only. The whole of Ligurium, Estium, perhaps even Nuria.
Of what are you speaking?
Would you hear me out without interruption?
You will never speak of it again?
I may never have the chance.
Oh, you are already prophesying doom. You have more cycles than I, but sometimes I feel you are as much in need of protection as my little Arid.
Let us find a place to sit that is not quite so exposed.
He took her arm and steered her away from the main crowd to the pillared edge of the great hall. The marble benches were all unoccupied, the night yet being young, and the company still bent on the type of merriment that one seeks in groups. The lighting was more discreet in this environ, allowing for semi-private conversations. Haldred seated herself gingerly and smiled at her brother.
I can hear the wags already. There goes the mad prince and his dull sister, trying to gain his first convert.
It is a serious matter, Haldred.
Vinky sounded tired and discouraged.
I said I would listen.
She clasped his hand, suddenly sympathetic. He took her hand in both of his and looked away at the merry, colorful groups.
How long has it been? More than 5 centuries since our land has been overrun. There is no relevance in tales that old, is there? I thought not. I read them for entertainment only, reliving the times when great and dreadful deeds seemed to float on every breeze. I spent most of my childhood in the bookkeeps of Aruis, adventuring with my mind, fighting against the impossible odds of the swarms, facing the unmentionable horrors of Kale summoning. You were just a little girl, fancy-free, playing at holding court with your many admirers. when I began to see a pattern in the unfolding events I had lived through so many times. I took the opportunity to travel to Nuria and visit the bookkeeps of Store and Belruth. My suspicions were confirmed and magnified. I spoke to some who had been children at the time of the last great swarm, in particular a Nurian man named Willen. He related the prophecy to me. I cannot tell what happened to me in his house. The priests told me he was a sorcerer, and I had fallen under some spell. I am convinced otherwise. I saw the events unfolding, in my mind's eye, but clearer, more clear than a dream. And when I had seen it, I had the last threads of a tapestry of immeasurable complexity and design. A master plan stretching over many lifetimes, woven in wars and betrayal, invasions and devastation, deceit and murder, but working inexorably, relentlessly towards one goal. Kale did not perish in the summoning Heldred, as we had been led to believe, but that did not perturb me nearly as much as the truth about our friend and ally, Malik Yulian. How old is he, Heldred? Have you ever given it any thought? Some Nurians live an exceptionally long time, but few have ever lasted beyond 600 cycles. The Aaronites and Ligerians succumb after a mere 100. The Vadran of Fenvale could achieve 500, perhaps. I could not find a record of this man's birth. I did find mention of his name several times, in the oldest of tomes, some of which reach back over 3,000 cycles. Who is this man? He is certainly one of the great ones of the Council, like Kale. But where Kale's evils are known, and his failings taught by our tutors, Malik's intentions are hidden in friendship and alliance. He is a traitor of the worst kind, and the thread of his hate and revenge spreads through our tapestry till it fills every field and town with slashing fangs and claws. He has unleashed every swarm that ever laid waste to our lands. He never resisted them, but only sacrificed a score of his most feeble warriors in a semblance of defiance, afterwards claiming grievous losses. He is a liar and a fiend, an evil older than the mountains, with his hatred bent always towards Nuria. Always Nuria! And our pathetic little kingdom is eternally caught in between. Allied with both, we suffer and are spoiled time and again. I know you think there are holes in my tale. For 500 cycles we have not seen a swarm. There is much worse coming than a swarm this time. He has planned carefully. Kale had been in his way and had to be removed. That had cost him a supreme effort. I do not know how he controls the swarm, but he has been preparing it all this time, nursing it back to irresistible strength, ready to unleash it for a fatal blow. This time, there will be no resisting it, no stopping it, no survivors emerging out of the forests and mountains to rebuild the shattered land. The Nurians will fall, their fortresses overthrown. Aaron is perpetually at war with them. They are not a shadow of what they have been, and we are their only ally. The prophecy offers little hope for Nuria, and for us, none at all. Salvation may come eventually, but it is balanced upon the tip of a blade, and it will come at the price of Ligerium, Estium, Lythan, possibly Fenvale, and Nuria itself.
He paused and looked back at his sister, his eyes still focused on faraway fields of destruction. Haldred had lowered her head and was staring at his hands still gripping hers. His words had led her through a labyrinth of thoughts, from pity for her self-deluded brother to grappling with the possibility of his being right. His voice came to her from far away.
The one safety is in escape, dear sister. Far to the east, out of the path of the swarm, past Nemona, perhaps into the forests of the east.
He paused again, unsure of the effects of his words.
Will you heed my warning? Say something, Heldred.
She looked up at him.
Say something? You pronounce doom on my whole world. What must I say? Men say you are mad. Could it be that you are right, Vengus? I need to think. I must be alone now. It is either that you are insane, or that we are all doomed. This does not make for cheerful meditation.
She abandoned an attempted smile halfway, pulled free of his grip, and left hurriedly. Vengus glanced up to meet the openly hostile gaze of his cousin Teoric. The latter smiled knowingly and then turned his back. Haldred could not find the forgetfulness of sleep till the third watch that night. Whenever she had dismissed her brother's words as the figments of his overstimulated imagination, a nagging doubt would creep back to overturn the weakly balancing cart of her reasoning. Of what prophecy had he spoken? Why could the priests not see the so-called thread of Malik's hate? Where would she go if she had to flee Amherst? Could the old writings be trusted? Why did Malik hate the Nurians? Wasn't Lord Ruin a Nurian? A picture of the smiling foreigner appeared before her mind's eye. He had been a royal in Nuria before his exile. Would he have had dealings with the southern Lord Malik? Would he know something of this enigmatic ruler's motives? Haldred made a decision. She would seek him out, even if he was the monster that had filled her with such dismay earlier that day at the arena. Perchance he would know.